There is a particular kind of cold that belongs only to old American money. It is not the loud arrogance of sudden wealth, nor the desperate hunger of those still climbing. It is a quiet cold, refined and absolute, settling into marble hallways, private gates, and fortunes so old they no longer need to announce themselves. Doris Duke was born into that cold, and from the moment she entered the world, it shaped not only her life, but the way truth itself would bend around her. On November 22, 1912, newspapers crowned Doris Duke the richest little girl in the world. She had not yet learned to speak, but her name already carried the weight of an empire. Her father, James Buchanan Duke, had transformed post-Civil War devastation into one of the most powerful tobacco monopolies in American history. From a small log shed in North Carolina to the American Tobacco Company, the Duke fortune did not merely participate in the system. It engineered it. And when antitrust laws finally dismantled that empire, the family was already elsewhere, diversified, insulated, untouchable. But wealth of that scale does not arrive without consequences. Doris Duke grew up surrounded by servants, chauffeurs, tutors, and guards, yet isolated from genuine human connection. Her childhood was not loud or chaotic. It was silent, controlled, watched. And when her father died in 1925, leaving her one of the largest inheritances on earth, he also left her a single piece of advice that would poison every relationship she would ever have. Trust no one. That lesson hardened into instinct. Doris Duke came to see affection as transaction, loyalty as something rented, not earned. She lived behind gates, literal and psychological, retreating into estates that functioned as fortresses against a world she believed wanted her money more than her humanity. Over time, control became her language of safety. And those who entered her orbit learned quickly that leaving it could be dangerous. By the late 1950s, that need for control would focus intensely on one man. Eduardo Terella, a decorated World War II veteran turned interior designer, was hired not merely to decorate Doris Duke's homes, but to shape her world. She paid him generously, relied on him absolutely, and structured her estates so he would always be near, always available, always hers. What began as professional dependence slowly took on the weight of possession. 7 years later, when Terella announced his intention to leave, to reclaim his independence and his career, something fractured. On the morning of October 7, 1966, the silence of Rough Point was shattered by shouting. Witnesses would later recall rage echoing through the mansion, the sound of a woman confronting abandonment in the only way she knew how. By the end of that day, Eduardo Terella would be dead beneath the rear axle of a 2-ton station wagon. And Doris Duke, shielded by her fortune, her influence, and the machinery of deference that surrounded her, would tell the world it had been nothing more than a tragic accident. That explanation would stand for nearly 6 decades. But silence, like old money, has a way of preserving secrets rather than erasing them. The hours leading up to Eduardo Terella's death unfolded with a tension that those inside Rough Point would later struggle to describe honestly. By the morning of October 7, 1966, Terella had already made his decision. After 7 years of service, he was leaving. Hollywood had called him back, offering creative freedom and professional dignity beyond the endless refinement of Doris Duke's private worlds. To him, it was a return to himself. To her, it was abandonment. Servants later told police they heard raised voices reverberating through the mansion's corridors. Doris Duke's anger was sharp, accusatory, cutting. Terella, by contrast, was described as controlled, firm, but calm. He had given years of his life to shaping Duke's estates, advising on acquisitions worth millions, living under the constant expectation of availability. Friends had warned him that Duke did not handle separation well. He had brushed those warnings aside, believing professionalism would protect him. It would not. At some point in the afternoon, the argument appeared to end abruptly. Doris Duke introduced a new task, almost casually. An antique dealer nearby had acquired a 15th-century wooden reliquary said to contain the bones of a martyr. Duke was an obsessive collector, deeply invested in religious artifacts of museum quality. She told Terella she needed his expert opinion before purchasing it. One last favor, she reportedly promised, before he left for California. They prepared to drive out together. Duke had rented a 2-ton Dodge Polaris station wagon, a massive vehicle even by the standards of the time. Investigators would later note that its automatic transmission and power steering made sudden acceleration easy, but stopping quickly extremely difficult. Terella drove. Duke sat beside him. Their route required exiting through Rough Point's heavy wrought iron gates, permanently locked and opened manually. According to Duke's own statement, Terella stopped the car 12 to 15 feet from the gates, shifted into park, and firmly engaged the parking brake. He exited the vehicle to unlock the gates, leaving the engine idling. It was a routine they had repeated countless times. Doris Duke always remained seated. She never took the wheel. But that October evening would break every precedent. 13-year-old Bob Walker was riding his bicycle along Ledge Road, delivering newspapers, when he heard arguing coming from inside the Duke estate. He later told investigators the voices stopped suddenly. Then, after a brief pause, he heard the roar of an engine. What followed, he would remember for the rest of his life. Police reconstruction suggested that Doris Duke slid across the bench seat, released the parking brake, shifted the transmission into drive, and accelerated toward the gates. Each of those actions required deliberate physical movement. This was not a car rolling forward because of a slipped foot. It was a machine being set in motion. The vehicle struck Eduardo Terella as he stood at the gates. According to forensic analysis, the impact launched him onto the hood of the car as it burst through the iron bars. Blood and tissue were later found not at the gates, but farther down Bellevue Avenue, suggesting Terella fell from the hood after the initial impact. Walker reported hearing brakes, then acceleration again, followed by screaming. He believed Duke pressed the accelerator a second time. The station wagon ran over Terella's body, dragging him across the pavement before crashing through fencing on a neighboring estate and slamming into a tree. When Officer Edward Angel arrived minutes later, he found Doris Duke calling out, my friend," while Terella lay crushed beneath the rear axle. Paramedic Judith Wartgo, the first medical responder on scene, would later testify that Duke appeared hysterical but physically unharmed, with only minor facial scratches. No significant bleeding. No severe trauma. This observation would later conflict sharply with claims that Duke required extensive medical treatment. Bob Walker, shaken but compelled by what he had seen, approached 3 times offering help. Each time, Duke reportedly screamed at him to leave. Her hostility frightened the teenager into retreat. That night, when Walker attempted to tell his father what he had witnessed, he was silenced immediately. His father warned him that Doris Duke was dangerous, surrounded by people who could make trouble disappear. Walker understood the message clearly. Stay quiet. The physical evidence, however, did not stay quiet. Sergeant Fred Newton examined the scene and noted deep tire gouges indicating forceful acceleration, not a gentle roll. Gate damage suggested a body had been driven up onto the hood. The autopsy conducted the next day revealed catastrophic trauma to Terella's skull and torso, while his legs remained largely intact. Forensic experts would later say this pattern was inconsistent with being pinned between a car and iron gates. It was consistent with being struck, carried, and run over. 4 deliberate actions had moved that car. For moments where choice existed. Yet within days, the narrative would be sealed. What remained was a body in the ground, a fortune intact, and a silence powerful enough to outlive nearly everyone involved. In the world Doris Duke inhabited, truth did not disappear. It was simply buried under influence, fear, and time. What happened after Eduardo Terella's body was removed from the pavement would prove almost as disturbing as the collision itself. In cases involving sudden death, especially one bearing the marks of violent trauma, procedure is meant to take over. Evidence is secured. Statements are collected. Suspects are separated from counsel. None of that unfolded the way it should have at Rough Point. Within hours, Newport Police Chief Joseph Radis personally assumed control of the scene. Instead of treating Doris Duke as the central figure in a potential vehicular homicide, witnesses later recalled Radis escorting her arm in arm back into her mansion. No immediate, detailed interrogation took place. No sobriety test was administered. No toxicology screening was ordered. The basic safeguards designed to preserve truth in the first critical hours were quietly bypassed. The most controversial decision came from Dr. Philip Mel Lister, the assistant medical examiner on duty that night. Mel Lister agreed to serve simultaneously as Doris Duke's personal physician while also participating in determinations surrounding the death. He placed Duke in a private hospital room, effectively shielding her from investigators. Mel Lister publicly insisted it was unthinkable to consider anything but an accident and claimed Duke had suffered significant facial injuries requiring extensive stitches. This claim directly contradicted the testimony of paramedic Judith Wortgo, who had seen Duke at the scene minutes after the crash. Wortgo stated clearly that Duke had only minor scratches, no visible bleeding, no injuries consistent with a violent impact. That discrepancy was never resolved. It was simply ignored. Police did not formally question Doris Duke until October 9, 2 full days after Terella's death. By then, she was surrounded by attorneys and guarded by German shepherds inside her bedroom at Rough Point. The interrogation itself was shockingly brief. According to transcripts, Lieutenant Frank Walsh and Detective George Watts asked only 4 questions. There was no sustained challenge to her account. No confrontation with physical evidence. No exploration of motive, despite witnesses reporting a furious argument hours earlier. 5 days after the incident, Chief Radis declared the case closed. The official ruling was an unfortunate accident, with no evidence suggesting otherwise. Rhode Island Attorney General Joseph Nugent reportedly expressed concern about the speed and shallowness of the investigation, but his unease did not alter the outcome. The machinery had already moved on. Behind the scenes, however, cracks were visible. Newport attorney William O'Connell later claimed that pressure to justify the closure led Radis to contact Doris Duke's lawyer, Aram Arabian, requesting additional documentation. What followed was deeply troubling. A 3-page interrogation transcript surfaced that appeared to have been written after the fact rather than recorded in real time. The document contained factual errors, including Duke's birth date, which she corrected by hand and initialed. To critics, it looked less like a record of questioning and more like a retroactive narrative designed to solidify an outcome already chosen. Then came the money. 8 days after Eduardo Terella's death, headlines announced Doris Duke's $25,000 donation to restore Newport's famed Cliff Walk. Soon after, additional funds flowed to Newport Hospital and local civic institutions. In 1968, Duke established the Newport Restoration Foundation, which would go on to purchase and preserve more than 80 historic buildings. Jacqueline Kennedy Onassis served as its vice president. The city was transformed, beautified, preserved. No court ever proved a direct connection between these donations and the handling of the investigation. None needed to. In communities shaped by wealth, influence rarely leaves receipts. Chief Radis retired 7 months later on a modest salary. By 1971, records show he had purchased condominium units in Hollywood, Florida. Investigative journalist Peter Lance would later document that Radis's neighbors included his brother-in-law, a man identified in law enforcement files as connected to organized crime figures. Again, nothing illegal was proven. But patterns do not require verdicts to be seen. Eduardo Terella's family pursued justice through civil court. In 1971, they filed a wrongful death lawsuit seeking $2.5 million. Doris Duke's attorneys fought aggressively, attacking Terella's character, questioning his earning potential, and minimizing his role in Duke's life, despite her own testimony that she relied on him for artistic decisions involving millions of dollars. The jury awarded $75,000. After legal fees, each of Terella's siblings received roughly $5,600 for their brother's death. Less than Doris Duke earned in daily interest on her fortune. She killed him twice, Terella's niece would later say. Once with the car. And again by erasing his worth. Doris Duke returned to her estates. The case faded from headlines. The silence resumed. But silence does not mean resolution. It means postponement. And decades later, when witnesses grew old, when power shifted, and when fear loosened its grip, the story of Rough Point would begin to surface again, carrying with it a question that wealth had never fully managed to bury. Was it truly an accident, or simply the moment when privilege proved itself stronger than truth? For decades after the gates of Rough Point closed behind the investigation, the story of Eduardo Terella's death survived only as a rumor whispered in Newport drawing rooms and remembered privately by those who had learned to stay quiet. Officially, the case was finished. Unofficially, it was never settled. Time passed, witnesses aged, and the machinery that had protected Doris Duke seemed permanent. Then, slowly, the silence began to fracture. One of the people most haunted by that October evening was Bob Walker. He grew up, left Newport, served in the Marine Corps, built a life far removed from the iron gates where he had once stood frozen in fear. Yet the memory never loosened its grip. For 55 years, Walker spoke of what he had seen to only a handful of people, always with caution, always with the understanding that some truths carried consequences. The warning his father had given him remained lodged deep in his mind. Powerful people did not need to threaten. They simply endured. The turning point did not come from law enforcement, but from journalism. Peter Lance, who had begun his career at the Newport Daily News shortly after Terella's death, carried his own unease about the case. As a young reporter, he had sensed that something was wrong, that the investigation had ended not because questions were answered, but because they were inconvenient. Decades later, with distance, resources, and fewer reasons to fear reputational pressure, Lance began digging again. His investigation was exhaustive. He re-examined police files, autopsy reports, witness statements, and physical evidence that had long been dismissed. He spoke to forensic experts, accident reconstruction specialists, and legal analysts who had no connection to Newport's social hierarchy. The conclusion they repeatedly reached was unsettling. The official version of events did not align with the mechanics of the crash, the injury patterns, or the sequence of actions required to move the vehicle. In 2018, Lance published his findings in Vanity Fair and later expanded them into a book titled Homicide at Rough Point. The title alone was a direct challenge to a narrative that had gone unchallenged for more than half a century. The response was immediate. Public interest surged. Media outlets revisited the case. And for the first time, Newport police faced renewed scrutiny over a decision made long before most of their current officers were born. It was Lance's reporting that finally pushed Bob Walker to step forward. In July 2021, Walker contacted authorities and gave a full statement detailing what he had witnessed as a teenager. Detective Jack West interviewed him for nearly 2 hours. According to police documents, Walker's account was initially considered credible. It matched physical evidence. It aligned with forensic analysis. It filled gaps that had never been properly addressed. For a moment, it seemed possible that the past might finally be reopened. But in November 2021, Newport police announced that the case would remain closed. The department stated that no new evidence warranted further review and reaffirmed the original conclusion of accidental death. There would be no grand jury. No formal re-examination. No accountability for decisions made in 1966. To many observers, the announcement felt less like a legal judgment and more like an institutional reflex. The same forces that had once hurried the case to closure now seemed to protect it from resurrection. Doris Duke was long dead. Many of the officers involved were gone. Revisiting the case would mean questioning not just one woman's actions, but an entire system's willingness to defer to wealth. Today, Rough Point operates as a museum. Visitors walk through manicured grounds, admire restored architecture, and read placards describing Doris Duke as a philanthropist, a preservationist, a benefactor of the arts. The description of Eduardo Terella's death has been updated to acknowledge controversy, yet it still carries the word accident. The gates remain. The iron still stands. Eduardo Terella rests in Holy Cross Cemetery in North Arlington, New Jersey. His name is absent from the foundations and institutions built in the wake of his death. His legacy exists primarily in fragments, in testimony, in the work of journalists and the memories of those who refused to forget. Doris Duke's estate, valued at over $1 billion at the time of her death in 1993, continues to fund charitable causes through the Doris Duke Charitable Foundation. Millions have gone to medicine, the environment, and the arts. Her name endures as a symbol of generosity and cultural stewardship. And yet, beneath that legacy lies an unresolved question that money never managed to silence completely. When power is great enough to shape investigations, rewrite narratives, and outlast witnesses, does truth still stand a chance? The story of Doris Duke and Eduardo Terella is not only about one death. It is about how privilege can insulate actions from consequence, how silence can be engineered, and how justice can be delayed until it no longer threatens anyone who remains alive. Some stories end with answers. Others end with reminders. This one reminds us that history does not forget. It only waits. In the years following the renewed attention to the Rough Point case, the story of Doris Duke settled into an uncomfortable space between history and myth. No court would reopen the file. No legal verdict would ever be revised. Yet the questions refused to disappear, because they were never truly about a single night in October. They were about what happens when wealth becomes powerful enough to outlive accountability. Doris Duke spent the final decades of her life surrounded by contradictions. To the public, she was a benefactor, a patron of culture, a woman who poured vast resources into preserving history and funding medical research. To those who knew her privately, she remained volatile, distrustful, and deeply isolated. Relationships followed a familiar cycle. Intense closeness. Total control. Sudden rupture. After Eduardo Terella, that pattern did not soften. If anything, it hardened. In 1988, at the age of 75, Duke adopted a grown woman named Chandi Hefner, claiming spiritual motivation. The move stunned even those accustomed to Duke's unpredictability. Within 3 years, Hefner was disinherited, publicly severed from Duke's life and fortune. The adoption, like so many of Duke's relationships, ended not with reconciliation but with erasure. Her final close companion was Bernard Lafferty, hired initially as a butler. Over time, he became confidant, gatekeeper, and manager of her daily life. When Duke died on October 28, 1993, at the age of 81, questions surfaced once again. A nurse alleged improper medication administration, raising suspicions of negligence or worse. An official investigation ultimately found no credible evidence of wrongdoing. Once again, the story ended without consequence. Duke's death activated the full machinery of her legacy. Her estate, valued at more than $1 billion, was funneled into the Doris Duke Charitable Foundation. The foundation has since distributed hundreds of millions of dollars to causes ranging from medical research to environmental protection to the arts. Her name became synonymous with philanthropy, engraved on institutions that would endure far longer than public memory of Eduardo Terella. This is where the moral tension of the story reaches its sharpest edge. Can generosity cancel harm? Can good deeds committed later absolve actions taken earlier? The law often answers these questions narrowly, through statutes and verdicts. History answers them differently, through patterns and perspective. Eduardo Terella's life was not defined by the way it ended. He was a decorated veteran, a skilled designer, a man who shaped beauty for others while trying to preserve a sense of self. Yet his legacy was flattened by the circumstances of his death. In court, his worth was reduced to earning potential. In official records, his final moments were labeled accidental. In financial terms, his life was valued at less than a fraction of Doris Duke's daily interest income. The imbalance is impossible to ignore. What makes the Rough Point case endure is not simply suspicion of guilt, but the clarity of the system that responded to it. At every critical juncture, decisions favored speed over scrutiny, deference over doubt, closure over truth. No single action proves corruption. Together, they form a pattern that many find impossible to dismiss. The renewed investigation in the 21st century did not fail because evidence was weak. It failed because institutions are reluctant to indict their own past. Reopening the case would have meant acknowledging that power once distorted justice in plain sight. That is a far more dangerous conclusion than leaving a single death unexplained. Today, visitors walk through Rough Point unaware of the tension embedded in its beauty. They see restored rooms, curated collections, and carefully written placards. History is presented as preservation, not confrontation. The gates where Eduardo Terella died stand quietly, transformed from a site of violence into a backdrop for reflection. Or forgetting. Yet stories like this do not vanish. They linger because they speak to something larger than one woman or one victim. They expose the fragile boundary between wealth and law, between privilege and consequence. They remind us that justice is not only about what can be proven, but about what is permitted to be questioned. Doris Duke left behind money, institutions, and a carefully managed legacy. Eduardo Terella left behind doubt, memory, and an unanswered question that continues to trouble those willing to look closely. And perhaps that is the final truth of Rough Point. Not that it proves guilt beyond certainty, but that it reveals how easily certainty can be manufactured when silence is bought, time is allowed to pass, and power is never required to explain itself. The story of Doris Duke and Eduardo Terella ultimately forces a reckoning that extends far beyond Rough Point. It asks an uncomfortable question that history repeats again and again, across countries, eras, and social classes. When power is concentrated enough, does justice still function as a principle, or does it become a performance designed to reassure rather than reveal? By the time Doris Duke died, the world around her had changed dramatically. The America of the 1990s was louder, more suspicious of inherited privilege, more willing to interrogate the myths of its elites. Yet even then, her story remained largely intact, polished by philanthropy and softened by time. Institutions bearing her name flourished. Restored buildings stood as visible proof of her generosity. The narrative of a troubled but benevolent heiress proved easier to preserve than the darker questions that lingered beneath it. This is not unusual. Societies have always struggled with how to remember powerful figures whose lives contain both creation and destruction. The temptation is to separate the two, to frame harm as an unfortunate footnote and generosity as the defining chapter. But the Rough Point case resists that separation. It sits precisely at the intersection where private violence meets public power. Eduardo Terella's death was never just about a car, a gate, or a single decision made in anger. It was about dependency, control, and what happens when someone accustomed to command encounters refusal. Doris Duke lived in a world where departure felt like betrayal, where people entered her life through invitation but could not easily leave. When Terella chose autonomy over proximity, he disrupted the balance that had governed their relationship. The consequences of that disruption were immediate and irreversible. What followed revealed the deeper truth of privilege. Not that it guarantees immunity in every case, but that it reshapes the environment in which truth is evaluated. Investigators hesitated. Procedures softened. Questions narrowed. Each individual choice could be defended as reasonable, even compassionate. Together, they formed a shield strong enough to deflect accountability. Decades later, when journalists and witnesses attempted to reopen the conversation, they encountered a different kind of resistance. Not intimidation, but inertia. Institutions do not like to revisit moments that expose their own failures. To admit that the Rough Point investigation was flawed would mean acknowledging that justice once bent under pressure. That admission carries implications far greater than one case. For the public, the unresolved nature of the story creates discomfort precisely because it denies closure. There is no courtroom confession, no dramatic reversal, no final judgment to point to. Instead, there is a trail of evidence, testimony, and contradiction that leads only to probability, not certainty. Some will always believe Doris Duke was guilty. Others will insist the absence of a conviction means the question is settled. Most are left somewhere in between. Yet uncertainty does not equal insignificance. In many ways, it is more instructive than a clean verdict. It exposes how systems function when tested by extreme wealth. It shows how fear and deference can shape outcomes without ever being written into law. It reveals how memory can be curated, edited, and preserved selectively. Eduardo Terella's name does not adorn foundations or museums. It survives instead through investigation, storytelling, and the refusal of a few individuals to accept official silence. That imbalance reflects a broader truth about whose lives are remembered and whose are negotiated away. The legacy of Doris Duke will likely remain divided. To some, she will always be a visionary preservationist who saved pieces of American history from decay. To others, she will remain a symbol of unchecked privilege, a woman whose power proved stronger than the mechanisms meant to restrain it. Both views can coexist, uncomfortable as that may be. Perhaps the most enduring lesson of Rough Point is not about guilt or innocence, but about vigilance. Justice is not self-sustaining. It relies on scrutiny, courage, and the willingness to question even the most respected names. When those elements falter, silence fills the gap. And silence, as this story reminds us, can last for generations. The gates at Rough Point still stand. They no longer guard secrets with the same authority they once did. But they remain a symbol, not only of wealth and isolation, but of a moment when truth approached power and was turned away. Whether history will one day push those gates open completely remains uncertain. What is certain is that the question will not disappear, because it was never just about Doris Duke. It was about how far money can reach, and how much it can ask the world to forget. In the end, the story of Doris Duke and Eduardo Terella does not resolve itself into a verdict. It settles instead into something far more unsettling, a mirror. It reflects how societies choose what to confront and what to preserve, what to question and what to quietly accept when the person at the center of the story is powerful enough to shape the aftermath. Nearly 6 decades after Eduardo Terella died at the gates of Rough Point, the official record still calls it an accident. That word remains intact not because it was proven beyond doubt, but because it was never truly challenged when it mattered most. Time hardened the conclusion, not evidence. Silence did the rest. For Doris Duke, history offered complexity rather than condemnation. She became a symbol of American old money at its most paradoxical, ruthless and generous, fearful and commanding, destructive and restorative. Her foundations continue to fund research, preserve art, and protect landscapes. Her name is spoken in boardrooms and museums, often without reference to the man whose death shadows her legacy. This is not unusual. Power rarely disappears. It simply changes form. For Eduardo Terella, there was no such transformation. His story survives almost entirely through absence. An absence of justice. An absence of acknowledgement. An absence of proportion between harm done and consequence received. He exists now primarily as a question mark in someone else's biography, rather than as a life remembered on its own terms. That imbalance is the quiet core of the Rough Point story. It is not only about whether Doris Duke intentionally killed Eduardo Terella. It is about how easily the system shifted to protect one life's narrative at the expense of another's truth. It is about how institutions respond when accountability threatens reputations that have already been woven into cultural heritage. There is a temptation, especially with historical cases, to seek comfort in distance. To say that standards were different, that times have changed, that such things could not happen again. History suggests otherwise. The mechanisms that softened scrutiny in 1966 did not vanish. They evolved. Influence still delays questions. Wealth still buys patience. Silence still feels safer than confrontation. And yet, the persistence of this story suggests something else as well. It suggests that time does not erase doubt. It preserves it. Each generation revisits Rough Point not because the past can be corrected, but because the pattern feels familiar. Because the question remains relevant. When power collides with truth, which one moves aside? Perhaps that is the final meaning of Rough Point. Not as a crime scene, or even as a scandal, but as a case study in how justice can be shaped without ever being openly denied. How answers can be replaced by conclusions. How memory can be curated until only the most comfortable version remains. The gates are still there. They open now for tourists, not for investigators. People walk past them calmly, unaware of how much they once represented. Control. Distance. Protection. But stories have a way of slipping through gates. As long as Eduardo Terella's name continues to be spoken, as long as journalists revisit the evidence, as long as discomfort survives alongside admiration, the silence Doris Duke was raised inside will never be complete again. And that may be the closest thing to justice this story will ever receive.